Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives.
Today on Good Sex at NYU, we are once again joined by Zabie Yamasaki, the founder of Transcending Sexual Trauma Through Yoga, which is an organization that offers trauma-informed yoga to survivors, consultations for universities and trauma agencies, and training for healing professionals. Zabie was on our podcast previously, and we highly recommend that you listened to the part 1 episode and find out more about her work. And look into some of the links in our show notes for our previous episode, because she shares so many amazing links. We'll probably put them in the show note as well. So thank you so much for being here again in part 2. We really appreciate you coming in and talking and getting a little bit more personal with us.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm excited. This is the fun stuff.
Yes. So thanks for sticking around to share more with us and with the audience. And just as a reminder, if there's any questions that feel like it's across a boundary, we will definitely honor that for you. And we want it to be an equitable space, so you can either just tell us this is a boundary, and then also if there's any questions that you want to turn around on us, we are more than happy to answer these questions as well.
Oh, thank you so much for just creating that safety in this space. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So who was your first crush? It could be a real person, literary, TV, or a musician.
Okay, so my first crush was Brandon. I can still see his face in middle school, and we would write these long love letters to each other on, the lined spiral notebook.
Yeah.
And fold them up origami style and sneak them into each other's orange and brown lockers. I feel like I can remember it like it was yesterday. It's making me blush even thinking about it.
Oh, it's fun to remember those.
Yeah, I think I still have a box full of like those notes. Not necessarily, I don't know if they were from friends or potential lovers, but yeah, those notes. I think that texting you've lost the art physically of notes. Sending notes.
Gosh, it was so fun. Remember we used to color them different colors and like pull here.
Yep.
Well, do you like me? Yes or no?
Exactly. XOXO.
Yes. So can you tell us a little bit about learning about personal boundaries and what that was like for you, developing communication skills, and what that process was like?
Yes. I really love this question because lately I've been thinking a lot about the role and just the concept that embodied boundaries have played in my life. And embodied boundaries are essentially the way that we attune to and honor our body's messages and responses and let that inform how we communicate and assert our needs. And it's basically involving the mind, body, and spirit into every experience and interaction that we have. And as I think about, various boundary violations I've experienced in my life, I often think about the way that those show up somatically in my body. For example, when I was working in a really toxic job and environment, I was physically ill, like almost every day that I was going to work, or getting a stomach ache when I was thinking about having a conversation with someone who was being disrespectful to me, feeling sort of jittery or anxious upon receiving a text from someone who doesn't value or respect my time, experiencing freeze or shut down in my nervous system when I'm in a space where it doesn't feel particularly safe for me. And I also think a lot about my relationship to boundaries in terms of the way my body has communicated no. And sometimes that's been a scratchy feeling in my throat. Other times it's been, having GI issues, or that swirling feeling in your stomach when you just feel so uneasy about something, or just shoulder aches and tension. And so for me, my journey has been knowing that I'm worthy of paying attention to the way that my body communicates these various boundaries to me, instead of constantly overriding the cues of my nervous system, which I did for so long. It took me so long to realize my body is always communicating with me, and I don't need to shut down these parts of myself at the expense of my spirit or at the expense of my well-being. There's no denying the impact that our relationships have on our nervous system. And of course, when we might have unhealthy boundaries, or we're experiencing a lack of boundaries, that impacts our overall physiology. So I think one of the biggest lessons for me has been not always approaching boundaries from a cognitive space. I think growing up, I was just taught that, well, just say no to that, or just don't do that thing, and I'm like, but I can't cut myself off from these very real physiological messages my body is sending me. And it's a reminder to me that boundary work is nervous system work. And kind of building upon some of the conversations we had in part one of our podcast, of getting still enough, having that mindful awareness to be in relationship with those sensations in my body. I also have a highly sensitive nervous system, so that also requires me to have more time to process and decompress and really be gentle with myself. So that was probably a long-winded answer, but it's something that's kind of been on my mind and heart lately, that has taken me many, many years in my own journey of learning personal boundaries, and how that has informed the way that I communicate and assert my needs.
I think it was beautifully stated. I think a lot of our listeners will really be able to relate to that. So I appreciate the answer. In thinking about communication, how do you react when it comes to conflict? I think, so many of the students that I work with really struggle when they're in conflict, because their body does react, and maybe they're not listening to that. They have different styles of communicating in conflict. They do have past history of trauma. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, what your journey has been like when it comes to engaging in healthy conflict.
Yes. Well, it has not always been so graceful. I will tell you that. Again, it's, when I feel so hijacked by something. Just this week, I had an example of, I was having an incredibly triggering text exchange with one of my friends, and it's taken time to be able to step away from something that's activating, or when there's conflict, in order to decompress and then come back when I can respond more fully with, the full senses of my mind, body, and spirit. I think the culture that we live in contributes to this sense of urgency, that everything needs an immediate response. And again, going back to the sensations that our body communicates to us, when we get caught up in that urgency culture, that contributes to us overriding those messages, because we're oftentimes responding to that email before we're ready, or responding to that text before we're ready. And yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in navigating conflict in a healthy way is to give myself time, is to just be kind and patient with myself, and not succumb to that pressure that we feel from so many. Because the person who might be violating the boundary or causing the conflict, of course they're going to want a response from you right away. You know, if they're adding fuel to the fire, you can be a great model by saying, I need to step away from this, and I need time to respond where my nervous system is in a place where, you know, I feel like I can come at this from a different approach. And I have to practice that in my marriage too. You know, there are times where we're in conflict, or we're both really stressed and we're trying to navigate our businesses and activities for our son, and, you know, bills and all the things. And we have to be gracious with each other and ourselves and kind of say, I need a time out right now. I will say that. I will say I need it to put myself on timeout, because if I don't, I'm going to respond in a way that is not gracious and is not kind and is not reflective of who I know I am. And he'll sometimes tell me, my husband, that my empathy meter is in the red, which is so devastating to me, because I think you both know by now I really strive to be a compassionate person. Yeah. So we kind of have these ways that we communicate with each other. When he tells me that, I know I need to, you know, scale it back a little bit, take care of myself, do less, close the laptop. You know, I think overstimulation also contributes to our ability to not always communicate in the ways that we want to. And I just try to remind myself that when I'm well resourced, I can communicate with more grace.
Yeah, I am really resonating with what you're saying. And I think just the instant responding, it feels like sometimes if I don't know what I want to say, I have an easy time to just like put my phone or laptop away and be like, I'm not going to respond to that because I don't know what I'm going to say. But if it's something that's really triggering and makes me mostly, I would say, mad and want to respond right away, is probably when I shouldn't respond. So I feel like what you're saying is really resonating with me, and I need to take a step back and really just put myself on timeout. And
well, I'm perfect at it. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Of course, no. I think that's so common, and I can.
But I think that's wise. I think what you're saying is really wise, of really just like not giving in to what society is telling us to do. And that might create a little more anxiety at the beginning of like, oh my gosh, this person's going to be even more upset, or it's going to cause even more tension if I don't respond right away. And that might cause some internal anxiety. But I think what you're saying is that in the end, you'll probably feel a little better if you like actually present yourself in a way that is true to you.
Oh my goodness. As you're saying this too, April, I had an interaction with one of my girlfriends who did something that was very upsetting. I didn't want to make a big deal of it in the moment as it was happening. And then I could really feel myself so triggered and so activated. And I had to text the next day. I had to say, you know, I'm not able to bounce back right now. I need time and I need space, and I love you, but I need a little space right now because I'm heartbroken, and I need time to process this before I'm ready to talk about it. And it was so hard for me to say that because the people pleaser in me and the anxiety in me, and it sometimes inclines me to want to just fix the conflict immediately instead of, again, giving myself that time. I took about a week and a half, and then we talked about it on the phone, and I was in such a different place at that time. It just, if you kind of think about the spectrum of your nervous system, when you're in your window of tolerance, that's a place where, you feel at ease. You can maybe feel your feet on the ground. You can communicate and assert your needs clearly. I was in that window where I could say exactly how I felt. And I just wish that we learned this earlier. So many of us in our adult lives are trying to learn this now, but it's something we need to start with, just so much earlier.
Yeah. I think there's so many things like that. Like, oh, if I'd have known this like 20 years ago, that would have been helpful.
Yes.
And speaking of something else that I think that I wish I would have known, the various different forms of intimacy. I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit more about how you define and experience intimacy really outside some of our traditional understanding of what intimacy means. I think sometimes we think of intimacy and we think of one specific type. And so I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more about your experience of this.
Oh my goodness. Well, I have to say that my female friendships are some of the most romantic relationships in my life. I think that and also the relationship that I've cultivated with myself. I think, there's something about the vulnerability with my closest girlfriends, the ability to feel so seen and say things out loud that I would never say in any other setting. And, it reminds me too that we can't rely on a partner to fulfill every single need that we have.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on the partner or on ourselves for this one person to fulfill every single need that we might have. And that's not fair, and that's not possible. And it's not fun. We need different people to fulfill different needs that we have. And I think that's the beauty of intimacy, is that there really are so many definitions of it and ways it can show up in our lives. And yeah, I would say, when I think outside of those traditional notions, it's really about that sisterhood that I have cultivated over the years. And it's just, those are some of the most beautiful relationships in my life.
Yeah.
Close friends can't beat them.
Yes.
But also it does take the stress off the one person, because I think society does put a lot of pressure on the soulmate and the best friend who's your lover. And so to be able to have the sisterhood, brotherhood, connection, belonging outside of that, as well as that, like it's one of the many facets to your world, and it brings balance into your life. And so I think that's something that I repeat often in my work with, talking to students around healthy relationships, is that like, it's hard to fulfill all of one person's needs, and so like, let's find other ways to do that. So I really just appreciate hearing what you said about that.
Well, I love that you brought that up, Danielle, because I think it also ties back to our conversation about healthy communication. I think a part of being able to do this and nurture this is where you can have open conversations within your partnership around, this is a lot for me to hold. My husband has told me that, because the work I do is really heavy, and I have to be mindful of how much I'm sharing with him, of how much I'm bringing into the sacred time that's so short that we actually have together after work, and after, we pick up our son, and bedtime and reading and dinner and bath time. And then we've got this, maybe an hour together where we can actually be present, that we can feel safe enough within the relationship to say, I love you, and maybe this is something you could bring up with your therapist, because I don't know that I have the capacity to hold this right now. Or, in our marriage, when we have been navigating particularly trying seasons, when, my husband had cancer, or we've gone through loss and miscarriage. And, there are times where the relationship's never going to be 50-50. It's always going to be, all of us are going to be constantly teetering based on the season that we're navigating. And I remember Brené Brown talking about how she has this sort of capacity practice that she does in her own partnership, where each week they're kind of sharing, I'm at a 20% this week, or I'm at 80%. And so they're looking at their percentages, and then they make a plan of kindness towards each other. And part of that might be, okay, we're going to get takeout this week because neither of us have it in us to cook any meals, or we're going to cancel that family outing because neither of us are going to be able to show up as our best selves. Or why don't you go with this kid to this activity and I'll stay home and rest? I think we just have to normalize not pushing through all the time, and making that plan of graciousness and kindness towards each other, like having that be just an open dialogue.
Yeah. I use that Brené Brown quote a lot as well. So I'm so
glad.
Do you?
I love
that. I like the step further, though, that you took it, because I definitely heard her say that in terms of like, I have this much percent, but like, now what do we do with that information of like, how can we still, and like, I think all the time of like, okay, my husband and I are supposed to meet on Thursdays to talk about groceries and meals for the next week. And like, some weeks it doesn't happen. And I can be upset and frustrated that doesn't happen, or I could be gracious with both of us and be like, we had a really hard week and a busy week, and that doesn't mean we can't get back on the horse next week. And so I think the compassion and empathy for self and partnership is important.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you tell us about some of the dominant messages you grew up around sex and relationships, and how that kind of shaped your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a proud daughter of immigrants. I'm South Asian, and I grew up with a very strong Muslim faith. And I will say, for me, this sort of intersection between my faith and my racial and ethnic background did not lend itself to open conversations about sex and relationships by any means. There was a lot of stigma about these topics growing up, and that resulted in a lot of secrecy and rebellion and shame at times, because I didn't feel like I had an open outlet to be able to talk about some of these things. Over time, it became easier to talk about them, particularly with my mom. But to give you some context, I didn't actually share with my parents that I had experienced sexual assault until 15 years later. So right when my book was coming out is when I felt like I needed to tell them. And, at that point, I had been on CNN talking about my story and about my work on NBC. I had written multiple articles about it, and I still hadn't told them, and there was so much I was hiding around my work in the world, which I'm so proud of. I'm so proud of everything I've done to get to this point. And, when I did tell them, they responded with so much love and care and belief and affirmation. And I know I'm so lucky to have had that, because I know many people do not experience that when they disclose. And, there was years that I felt like I was sort of doing my work in secrecy, because I think they knew ultimately she's got this passion for this work, and clearly there's got to be some personal connection, but there was never an open dialogue about it, and it made me wish I would have talked to them sooner, and that they could have been a part of some of those career and professional milestones without me still feeling like that little girl that was, experiencing shame and stigma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. I'm connecting with you, even though we come from very different backgrounds and cultures, because I grew up in a family that we also didn't really talk too much about it.
It's so interesting how that just unspoken language sometimes that we navigate, where you can be so open about your story or your work or your lived experiences in one setting, and then such a different version of yourself with your family. It takes a lot of time to reconcile that and just and be with it. Sometimes there's not even an answer to it. It's just sort of is what it is, and we're sort of just navigating our relationship to it over time. So yeah, I definitely identify with you on it's just wild.
Yeah. You mentioned the immigrant culture and your Muslim faith, and I'm curious if there was any specific teachings or views from within those traditions that you either still carry or have influenced your views on sex and relationships, and if there was any tensions that you kind of have had to unpack over the years. You mentioned a little bit about the shame and whatnot, but if there's anything else that you've kind of had to unpack.
Yeah, I mean, I have had a lot of boyfriends in my life, and I have had a lot of relationships, and I had a lot of fun in college. And, there were so many times that I wish that I had had space to kind of explore those desires, or or just what pleasure looks like. It's actually really nice kind of talking to you both about healthy sex and healthy communication and healthy boundaries, because so much of what I talk about is sexual harm and trauma, and sort of it's nice to have space to just talk about what brings us pleasure and to talk about what, healthy sex looks like. And I think there was just so much, even now, given what I do in the world and that I'm very public and have written books on this topic, it still feels pretty radical to be, a South Asian Muslim woman talking about these topics. So there has certainly been tension there of just kind of having to navigate the balance of what feels appropriate to say and what feels okay to say, and what's out in the open now and what's still, things are a little tender, so I would definitely say, I think growing up in with that immigrant mentality as well, it was, we were always so over programmed. And it was always about, our productivity, our worth was tied to how much we were doing. So we were in Arabic class. We were doing every single sport. I was in every single extracurricular activity. I was in student body leadership. And then that continued on into college and into grad school. Like, there were parts of my identity that came with me into every space. And it's only now that I've had the time to process that, wow, I don't actually want to be doing all the things. I want to have space to just be me authentically, just as I am. And it's actually been nice to kind of navigate this new relationship with my parents, who are the most loving and beautiful humans, and giving ourselves the space to kind of recalibrate to probably this version of me that they had no idea their daughter was going to be out there talking about, sexual assault and all, and, healthy sex and all the things. But here we are, and there's space for all of it.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Well, we're glad that you're here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there are people out there that are glad to see someone that looks like them and to have some similar background as them to be talking about this. And we're glad.
Yeah. So how do you navigate the intersectionality of identities within the context of sex and relationships? Are there unique challenges and joys that you've experienced in that?
That's such a good question. Oh, So when you say the intersectionality of identities, you're talking about like race and gender and as a
Ability. Yeah. Like
race.
we've had other guests who have also talked about like their size, like height versus weight
Mm,
versus immigrant and, second generation. Like we've had lots of different like people interpret that question in ways that I didn't even think about. So I think it's like we have so many different identities.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are so many identities that I've kind of shared with you just, growing up in um, sort of that immigrant mentality, being South Asian, being Muslim. And I've also always had a really outgoing personality. And I think that has played into just my intimacy with people in general. I've had people share with me like, I haven't even known you that long, but I just, I feel very comfortable with you and I feel very safe with you. And it feels, I think that's something that I've just cultivated over the years of I'm such a relationship
Mm.
person and I'm a connector. And I think all of these parts of myself I bring to each of my relationships. And it is joyful to be kind of to have the ability to connect with someone who maybe we on paper we have nothing in common, but to be able to find that common ground and have a beautiful dialogue. I love that. I love being able to come into new spaces and just everyone's always like, oh, just if someone's there that, is either came alone, they're like, send Zabie over to talk to that. Like I'm always the person that they're sending to make someone feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm proud of that. It brings me a lot of joy. And I also think it is a connection is a level of intimacy, whether that is in a romantic relationship or not. I really thrive off of my ability to connect with people and yeah, I do think that is a form of intimacy and certainly joy.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. You mentioned pleasure before. I want to kind of back up and go back to pleasure and think about how your understanding of pleasure has evolved over time and how you've learned to kind of prioritize and explore pleasure in different ways in your life.
Yeah. I think pleasure for me has been recognizing that I'm worthy of my own time and my own affection and my own compassion and my own energy. As, someone who has spent a large portion of her career pouring into others, I've gotten really used to just pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. And it has been a lesson for me in breaking patterns around overworking as a means of coping or overgiving as a means of coping or, having unhealthy boundaries because I thought that was what empathy looked like. I think I have really had to recalibrate my relationship to pleasure, and that has been moving my needs up to the top of my list and really cultivating a life that allows me to care for myself in ways that are abundant and not sort of squeezing it into parts of the day where I might have a window. I used to, have these long working days. I would listen to a podcast related to trauma or listen to the news on my way to work. And then I would be in back-to-back meetings with students or teaching classes or doing outreach work. And then, I would eat lunch at my desk, just like shovel it in my mouth. I would barely see the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes I would go to yoga and I wouldn't even be able to move my body. I would just lay there for an hour because I was so fatigued and exhausted. And then I'm like, okay, maybe let me do something to take care of myself. It was always such an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
And now pleasure for me has been just taking care of myself is the priority, and then I'm fitting the other things in where they're going to fit in. And that has been just an amazing, non-linear journey for sure, but it's been amazing to lean into that.
Yeah, that's great. I love that framework of you in the middle and fitting everything else in around it.
Yes. And, I'm sure you both can relate to this, but I've been talking a lot about just the pressure that so many of us have to always hold the default nervous system in the room. This pressure to always be a regulated, articulate presence, whether that's through parenting or caregiving or our profession or leadership, or just showing up in spaces every day while we're tending to our own wounds. So many of us are just trying to be okay and trying to function and trying to move through. And I think the more gentleness that we can offer ourselves in this process of just, you don't have to have it all together all the time. You're worthy of rest. You don't have to be exhausted in order to rest. You can actually just choose that. It's
Have you been talking to my therapist?
Yes, we consulted.
Speaking directly to me.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we're at our last question. So, what does good sex mean to you?
Good sex means to me comfort, safety, respect, value, and just feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling like I can change my mind at any time, and that's going to be supported and appreciated. And I think it's so interesting thinking about my journey of my various sexual relationships over the course of my life. And now my husband and I have been married for almost 10 years. And, sex is a little different for us right now as we're trying to get pregnant. So it feels more, structured and timed, and not as, all these other things that I'm saying, which I think, it ebbs and flows as we move through different journeys and seasons in our life. But I think ultimately it really just comes down to that comfort and safety piece for me. That really is everything.
Yeah. I can definitely relate. And sex gets better on the other side of not trying to have a baby.
I'm ready to get back to the sex outside of trying to conceive, where it's more spontaneous and fun and so timed.
April and I talk a lot about the definition of sexual project, which there's this book called Sexual Citizen, and they coined this term called sexual project. And it's an ongoing, reason why you engage in sex. And it can shift and change in the moment or over time. And you can have more than one. And what I'm hearing is your sexual project right now is to have a baby. So maybe at some point it'll get to shift back to fun.
Yes.
Pleasure, like a little bit of, maybe there's some pleasure in there now, but maybe that's not the focus. So hopefully you'll get to shift back to something else.
Oh, I can't wait for that time that awaits me.
Thank you for being here.
Anything else that you would want to share with our listeners today?
I don't think so. I think, we've just covered so many different topics. I'm excited for all the nuggets, and excited to hear what people connect with.
Yeah, I'm excited to share it with clients, with my team. So a lot of great wisdom within the words that you spoke today. So really appreciate it. And we're going to put some links to you in our show notes so people can find you and your great work. So thank you so much for being vulnerable and being willing to come on a podcast called Good Sex.
It was so refreshing. It was so fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Baini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellum, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.